what we have here is a new home, new construction build. And the contractor or general contractor contacted us and wanted to know the best way of achieving grass strips, grass runners, across a new driveway. So what we explained to them was when they set up their concrete forms, which are typically just a pressure treated wood or a bender board, where they were going to construct their wood forms to incorporate the turf bands going across. We'll show you that here in just a second. Being that this was a new construction job and new concrete pour for this driveway, the easiest way to do this was to instruct the guys forming the form boards for the concrete outline to install and account for the use of 1x4 or 1x6 pressure treated boards. What we instructed them to do was create their outline for the pads, and then if they were doing, and in this particular instance they're doing 6-inch bands across, so what we had them do is we added, or had them add, their 1x6s or 1x4s in a vertical application to keep their concrete in, but they recessed or lowered the concrete form down 1 inch. We're using 2-inch tall grass, and we had them recess it down 1 inch, which is right about where the thatch layer is, so that when the car rides over this, they'll only depress down the primary fiber sticking up, which is only about 1 inch. So 2-inch grass, recess 1 inch from top of grade. Here you can see that they put in their forms, which were 1x4s, and they lowered it down below top of grade by 1 inch, and they put a cap across, which we'll show you here. This is a 1x6 that spans across the opening, and this is nailed or secured in to the verticals. So you can see here, what this allows them to do is they can pour their concrete to the top of the form. Then they can use their floats to smooth out the concrete, their brooms to give a broom finish, and then their finishing tool, which is runs along the edge to round it off. So they were able to easily complete their project without any hindrance by setting the forms up in this manner. So this is after they've set their forms up, and then this is just prior to adding the cap. So you can see how they spaced it, staked it out, and then they were able to put their cap on top and finish the concrete. And what we're doing is we're coming back, we're removing these, and we're backfilling this with base material. Alright, so what we're doing is we're just taking our Saccrete, or basically our paver base, and we're just filling in, try not to make too much of a mess, but we're just filling in the spaces, and we're just kind of controlling how much comes out. And what I want to do is I'm just taking a couple of my basic tools. I've just got my broom, my scraper, a piece of 2x4, and my hammer. And I want to just get all the rocks into the area. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to take the scraper and we're going to run along the edges. And I'm using a scraper for a couple of reasons. Is that one, obviously the concrete, when it goes in, it gets watery and it can get down beneath the form boards. And what we want to do is just run that scraper along the top of the form and get all of that loose concrete. All that is just some over pour, if you will, or some of it leach down in through. But what it's going to cause to do, it will cause the turf basically being level and flush all the way across. It'll cause part of it to lip up like that. And then what that'll translate into is the fibers, instead of the fibers being vertical like this, is they'll actually curl over on themselves like that and kind of point backwards the other way. So you'll get the material where it kind of bunches up, and you're going to notice that and see that. So what we want to do is make sure we get all of that extra concrete scraped off. And little details like this, kind of like a little pro tip, little details like that is important, because that's going to make all the difference in the world of what your product looks like at the end, versus something that was just thrown in rather quickly. So what we're doing is we're just going through and we're going to scrape all of this here, and we'll get some of the material that gathers up. But the main reason why we're doing that is that we're going to take our 2x4 and we're going to place it in there. We're going to take our hammer and we're just going to hit it a couple of times. You can already see that that 2x4 is basically pretty much just disappeared down into the spacing. And what we've done is we've taken all of this loose material, we've compacted it, compressed it, we've gotten all the air out of it. But now that it's in there and it's nice and tightly packed, once we do the compaction all the way flush with the top of the boards, this will never settle. And we'll never get that little skateboard ramp or U look in the actual turf when everything settles. So that's the reason why I don't like to use dirt, I don't like to use sand. I just like to use the paver base, the rock. It drains extremely well. So when the water runs down, it runs down in the side, it just gets down in the drain rock and then runs out underneath through the slab. But once the rock has been compacted or compressed in nice and tight, is that it's not going to move anymore. There's less chance of it moving versus if you were to put in like some base or some sand. So what we want, the reason why I like the 2x4 is that we've obviously got the contractor, when he put his molds in or forms in, we got 2x4 and I can turn it on its side. And then I can come through and I can tamp it in, or I can turn it vertical. And then that way I can get around each one of the stakes and get myself some nice clean edges that I can kind of compact in all the way around. That way I don't have any areas that could eventually start sagging later. And then once I'm past it, then I can turn it back on my side. And then all I'm going to do is just work my way down, and then I'll come back through and I'll fill some more material in, and I'll keep compacting. Now if I didn't do this, at some point this would have settled and compact, all the air would have came out of it, the water or rain would have pushed it down, and then we would have had a problem. We would have had to come back and obviously do a repair. So just take a little extra time to go through and do this, and it'll make all the difference in the world in a finished product looking like a professional install. So this is the look that we want to achieve. And the other important thing is these bands are 5 to 6 inches across. If you look at how a car tire sits, the footprint that actually makes contact with the pavement or the road is on a small car we're talking 10-12 inches, on a truck where it's like 14. So it's really dependent on the size of the tires. So we go 5 to 6 so that when the cars roll over this, the cars just roll over it. The car tire doesn't depress in and then come back out. And then that's also why we don't put the turf to top-of-grade with this, because then all the car tires will do is just flatten it. And I can show you with the next door neighbor, they did turf bands, but they ran their turf right up to the top, and they just now have green flat lines across there. So we drop it down, recess. The turf that we're using is 2 inches tall, so we're going to drop it 1 inch below top of grade, so that the secondary thatch layer remains untouched, and only the top of the fibers, when the car tires run over it, they just press it in a little bit, and then it's able to spring back up. So how much you recess this is really dependent on the turf that you use. Obviously, if we're using something that's a little over an inch, inch and an eighth, inch and a quarter, we would have raised this up to 3/4 to 1/2 of an inch, so more of the turf blades were sticking up. So it's important to set your depth based on the turf that you're using. It's a little bit of a pro tip there. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do the installation of this, but since everybody's going to be looking at it from the street. What we want to do is face the grain falling towards the street. So when everybody looks from the road up towards the house, they're getting the best view. So anybody walking by, driving by, and obviously when we pull into it. So what I'm doing here, we already lined one up, just lining it up on the inside of the forms areas that we tamped, and I'm laying it over it. And what I'm doing is I'm just cutting along the edge of the concrete so that it falls right into place. And then if we have to trim up any sections, we can come back and trim it. But this is a fairly quick and easy process once you learn the knack of it. Basically what we're doing is we're just taking our razor, and the blade flexes a little bit, and we're pushing it up against the edge of the concrete and using that as a guide, and then I just run it along the edge of the concrete, cutting the grass. Now this is really thick. This is a 90-ounce product, so I can't go really fast because I get a lot of fibers. You can see them here that I'm cutting, so we'll go real slow with this. And you can see, so it's a lot of material that I'm having to cut through, so you'll have to stop periodically and clean out your blade. As I'm just peeling this back, and I'm doing it so that I'm also pressing in with my fingertips and using my thumb to hold the turf back. And I'm pushing the turf down inside the actual area here, the band. And by keeping it pushed down in, I'm able to ensure that I'm cutting exactly the amount of turf that needs to go in it. Because if I had too much, the turf would roll up, and if I cut in too far, I'd have some big gaps. So what we want to do is just take our time. We'll just keep working our way down. And once you get comfortable doing this, and like I said, what I'm doing is I'm pushing this against the edge of the concrete, and this blade bends a little bit, and so it's at a little bit of an angle here that I'm pushing against. So that way I could literally do this with my eyes closed. Because I'm just using the concrete as a guide. But also by doing this process, it dulls the blade up rather fast because you're running it against the edge of the concrete. So once you're running into some difficulty cutting, that's an indication that it's time to swap your blade. Now it's also important to go small sections at a time, because if you're getting off on your cuts and you're getting too much material, like I'm getting a section right here, I need to stop and make an adjustment. There we go. And then I can come back and correct that. And doing an entire and making a long mistake, a large mistake, I just made it. It's easy to come back and trim and correct. Now, this is a perfect indication of something that needs attention or a little bit of an error. So you can see the blades here leaning forward. All these blades are standing straight up. So that's obviously indicating the grain. But right here, you'll notice that here, this turf is pushing back on itself, and that's because we have a little too much material that's rolling up in against the concrete, which right here you see no black. Right here we've got a little bit of a ridge of material, so we're gonna have to trim that. This side, it's not too bad. You can always take your back side of your knife and just kind of push that down into place, and it could be a little bit of debris or rock or some concrete on that side. But this side right here definitely needs some attention. And if we were to flip this over, yep, you could see I'm off by about 2 beads right here. So now a good way to do this is to obviously use a straight edge, but since I can see where my error is, and I'll just stay right in between these, right there. Perfect. Falls right into place and looks very natural now. So either a very sharp knife or a good pair of scissors to make any of these little trimming corrections that you need to do is recommended. Cutting your turf strips in, we do have a couple of options, which I illustrated before, but we'll just recap. Either you can take the turf and lay it in the grain direction that it needs to go, and we drop it in place. Make sure that it's lined up, and then we can take our razor and we can press along the side part here and cut along the edge. Another method you can do, which I'll illustrate now, is that you can take the turf, and I'm just illustrating here on a smaller piece. Now, it's always best to double check your measurements for each run or each end. So I know that here is 5 3/4 and about 5 5/8. So we'll run this at it's almost 5, it's right in between. It's just a hair over 5 5/8. So we'll just cut it to 5 5/8 because obviously the turf fills in that area. So what we're going to do, I double check both my sides for measurement, and I'm going to take, if you've got to do a long run, you can take a tape measure and you can mark off and create a couple of notches across the full span of the turf. And what works really good is a chalk line. Blue because it's temporary, and if you get it on the concrete it washes off pretty easily. And you can snap that line across, and then you can use a straight edge to follow across with it. Now this is a drywall T-square. It's 48 inches, and you can use that to follow along the snap line, or since this is a much smaller run, what we're going to do is I'm just going to use this to span the whole way. And I'm going to line up against the 2 notch catches. Now, obviously, these are very sharp, so what we want to do is we want to apply some pressure down on the T-square so this doesn't move. And we're going to take our knife and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to press up against the T-square, so we use it as a guide. But we don't want to press so hard that we're moving the T-square off our notch. So what we're going to do is just apply some pressure on this. Now, not too much pressure because we don't want to cut through. And if you've taken some of the blades, this is pretty thick material, it's 90 ounces. But if you've taken something like a 60 ounce or 70 ounce and you've pressed really hard, those blades are going to fall to one side. And if you cut too deep, you're going to end up cutting more blades than you want to, and it's going to make that edge on that side much shorter. So, sharp blade, apply pressure the whole way, and we just run this against it. We now have a nice straight cut that we can drop into our turf band. And then we'll line it up against the next piece. And seam has disappeared because we lined it up. And what we're doing is, the reason why we're doing it this way, yes, we could have made it real easy and measured out 18 feet and cut 15 foot wide by 18 foot and then ran just all vertical strips, meaning I would have stayed in between the lines. That would have been super simple, but that would have meant that the grain was falling to the side yard, not out towards the street, and we would have had to obviously purchase a lot more turf than what we needed, because really these bands were just under 6 inches. There's 5 of them, so that's about 3 feet, and you would have been left with a 12 by 18 foot piece left over. Again, another pro tip, but the correct way is that you want to face the grain falling towards the direction that you are going to see it the most, or people are going to see it from the most. So from the road facing forward, we want the grain to fall that way. That's the best view. And then whether they're driving from one direction or the other, they're always getting the good view of the grass. Key thing to remember is that everybody wants the benefits of synthetic grass. They just don't want to look like they have synthetic grass. So always just try to keep the grain facing in the direction that people are going to look at it from the most. Now obviously if this was in the backyard, we would have the turf falling towards the house versus in the front yard where we have the grain falling away from the house towards the street. So we got that one in, and I'll do another one here, and we'll get these installed real quick, and then we'll get on to the next part of the installation. When installing your turf bands, and we're ready, we've already completed all the base work underneath, compacted, and everything's been cut in, and it's time to secure the product. What I like to use, it's called a TEKS screw. It's a metal lath screw. It's a pan head screw. Basically, it's like an aluminum with a zinc coating on it. It doesn't rust. It basically just oxidizes. So you'll get some of that white powder on it over time, but that's about it. And what I like about using this product is that instead of doing stainless steel staples or nailing the product in, which the nails would eventually rust, and if you ever have a problem, all you have to do is you come back and you back them out with a screw gun, and then you can do whatever you need to do underneath and then put it back, and it looks like, you know, that you never had to do any repairs to it. So what I like to do is, obviously I'm going to work both sides kind of across from each other as we go, but you want to make sure you pull the turf good and tight so you've got any stretch out of it. And what I try to do is basically separate the fibers, if you will, and try to get the screw in between a tuft. And then I just screw it in, and it's important not to over screw, because again, you don't want to drive the turf down into the wood and leave what I would refer to as a pucker mark, so you can see where you screwed. And it's also important too that you want to try and pull the fibers out of the way so that they do not get trapped underneath the head of the screw, which would then cause that turf to appear shorter in that area. And then in essence what you've done is created a pucker mark as well. And again, like I said, there's different installation methods, but when you're using the pressure treated wood or a synthetic nailer board type material, screwing it in is a fantastic method. You want to go anywhere between every 4 to 6 inches, because now the turf's not going to come up. You can pull on it and it really locks it in. That pan head, that large pan head, really holds the turf down in place. So it's a fantastic option for doing this type of installation, and just in general installations around your yard where you're utilizing a nailer board to work with.